Hello, my name is Dr. Joseph Crumley. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'll be your narrator through this module on loss and ambivalence. This module is one of 5 modules that have been developed for a course entitled Engaging Relative Caregivers, Managing Risk Factors in Kinship Care. You're now about to watch a videotape of me doing training with professionals, and I'll be addressing several questions. The first will be, what are the cues and sources of loss and ambivalence experienced by relative caregivers? The second question will be, what are the goals, approaches, and scripts you can use with relative caregivers in helping them manage their feelings of loss and ambivalence? And the third question is, what are the differences in feelings of loss and ambivalence between relative caregivers and non-relative foster parents and adoptive parents? For those of you in the viewing audience, I'd like you to also answer and address 2 other questions. How does loss and ambivalence impact the caregiver's ability to provide permanency, safety, and well-being? And more personal is the question, what goals and approaches and scripts will be useful in your practice in working with relative caregivers? So please sit back, relax, and I'll rejoin you at the conclusion of this training. Thank you. Okay. Loss and ambivalence. I'd like you to be able to experience what relative caregivers are feeling when they're asked to take a child into their home. So what I'd like to do is provide you with a scenario. And the scenario starts off like this. Imagine one of your relatives asking you to take their children into their home. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be because of medical reasons. Maybe they're involved in surgery. It could be because of financial reasons. Maybe there's divorce, separation. Maybe they're moving. Whatever the reason is, they're asking you to take their children into their home. And today is Tuesday. You have until Friday to get ready for them to come into your home. Average time for relative caregivers, 48 to 72 hours. That's how quickly they're doing this. And in fact, I'll do you a favor. I'm going to wait until next Monday, so you've got the weekend now to kind of get ready for them to come in. And here's my question to you. How does this change your life? And how does this affect you emotionally? And give me the first 1 or 2 word answers off the top of your head. Work schedule. I can't afford this. Stress. Room. Oh my God.
School.
Yeah, school.
How long they gonna be here?
How long they gonna be here? Where they gonna sleep? Space. I can't afford this. Daycare. Any of you have spouses? What are you gonna have to do with them? What does that make you think of? I better talk to him before I get him into this, or I better put him out if he doesn't, okay? But yeah, those are real issues. How many of you would be doing this for the first time? What are you thinking? Can I do this? Can I put up with this? For how many of you would this be a second time? Now what would you thinking? Again? I thought I was done with this. Okay. I'm too old for this. Okay, now let me add to the scenario. You've just found out that an agency is involved with this, with the family. And you've also found out that maybe there was abuse or neglect or drugs or alcohol involved with why they're now leaving. How does this affect you? How does this change your life? How do you feel? 1 word answers. This might affect with my entitlements, messing with my check. I don't want the government in my home. How long? I hope the kid isn't crazy. Yeah, because they've been exposed, right, to drugs, alcohol, whatever. What am I bringing into my house? No privacy. How much money? How will this affect my children? What am I exposing my children to? Okay, I think you got it. I think you got it. When we first began working with kinship care, we didn't assess ambivalence. We didn't deal with loss. In fact, we felt as though relative caregivers should, without hesitation, take these children in. That they should do us out of obligation and out of loyalty to the family. And consequently, we were putting the children in And we were closing the cases without supports and without finances and without services. That was best practices 15, 20 years ago. And the outcomes that we were having were, you can just imagine, repetition of abuse and neglect by guess who? Caregivers. Yeah, that was a real surprise by the caregivers because they were so overwhelmed and they were so angry and they were so frustrated and we weren't accessing it and they were just walking around like time bombs. We were having disrupted placements and we were having children constantly coming back into the system. So let me just kind of summarize some of those things that you just mentioned. Some of those reasons and sources of ambivalence, changes in future plans. I think Peter mentioned space. Your priorities are changing. Changes in relationships with the birth parent. Now that you're working for the agency, you now have to protect who? Thank you. And that's going to change the relationship with that birth parent. Not knowing how long, financial, legal risks, what am I exposing my children to? What are the special needs of those children? What am I bringing into my house? The ability to address those special needs. Intrusion by the agency was something that you also mentioned, as well as being perceived as being disloyal by that birth parent and by the extended family for working with who? The agencies. And then once the agencies come in, you're feeling like you're being scrutinized, you're being watched, and then there's safety issues because you now have to protect the child and put the needs of the child over that of who? The birth parents. So what are the cues that you need to look for? Because these are cues that we didn't pick up before. They might be, relative caregiver might be saying, I'm not sure if I can do this. Is it okay with the child's family, with the child's birth parents? Because you need to know if you're going to be safe. That's why you have to ask that question. And that can make you very ambivalent. So there's a lot behind that. Do the children's parents agree? You know, are they going to be knocking on my door? Is it a safety issue? Is it a protection issue? I don't get along with my brother and sister. You see the issue again? What are they going to do? Are they going to act out? This becomes a safety and protection issue for the relative caregiver. What if if it doesn't work out? Can I change my mind? I only want to be a grandparent or aunt or uncle, and for how long? So those are the cues that you're looking for and what's important is if you don't hear those statements, use your assessment and interviewing skills to see if they're feeling that way. Ask those questions that will allow them the chance, that will elicit those responses if they're there. So what are your goals? Here's where we begin to see the difference between kinship care and non-relative foster parents and adoptive parents. When a foster parent is transitioned and starts out being a foster parent or adoptive parent, it's planned, they pursue it, it's with training, and it's with services before the child gets there. For relative caregivers, it's in a crisis, it's by default, it's without training and support. So when you start looking at that, for a foster parent and adoptive parent, they come into caring for the children knowing that they want to. So we then provide them a process to figure out if they can. For relative caregivers, they're coming into this not sure if they want to. So we need to provide them a process to figure out if they should. Very different kinds of approaches. So if you understand the differences, and if you're approaching relative caregivers with, hey, you're ambivalent, it's normal, let's see if you should, then you're going to only want them to commit to the process to determine if they can become a permanency option. So that's why we start with committing to a process, not committing to being the permanency option, but to a process to decide if they can become a permanency option. That's different from foster care and adoption. So if they're committing to the process, then you want them to be involved in determining what are the benchmarks that are going to let them know that they can or can't do it. To what extent are they going to be involved? What's their threshold for sacrificing? What's their threshold for tolerance? Can they tolerate a child who is an infant as opposed to a child that's school age, as opposed to a child with an adolescent? What's their tolerance? What's their threshold for tolerance as it relates to special needs children that are coming in with histories of abuse and neglect compared to children coming in with sexual abuse and neglect? What are their coping skills? What are their support systems? And this last bullet, which I think is crucial, is making sure that if they can't do it, that there's an alternative plan for them and for the child, so that this prevents them having to go into a crisis. So what are some of the scripts that you might want to think about? You've got to normalize the ambivalence. When we started the practice early before, back in 10, 15, 20 years ago, we didn't normalize ambivalence. We didn't destigmatize it. If anything, we acted as if it was abnormal, and we wanted them to feel guilty. And we would talk about the fact that they should be obligated, that they should want to do this. Now they need to hear us saying things like, you should be ambivalent. You did this unplanned in a crisis, and you shouldn't feel bad about it. I can certainly understand why you're hesitant. You might even continue to feel hesitant or ambivalent, even if you decide to take the child. So we normalize it, we take away the stigma, and the third point, which is so crucial, is making sure that they feel entitled to be involved in that process. They have a right to be involved in that process. And we need to hear them, and so they need to hear us say, it's only fair that you have time with the child to determine if it's in your and the child's best interest to live together. You have to be okay for the child to be okay. So that sense of entitlement to a process to figure this out for themselves, we want to make sure that they're feeling that as well. It's also crucial that they then identify the benchmarks. So they're going to need to hear us say, we need for you to tell us what you need in order for you to even try and consider taking care of your grandchild or your niece or your nephew. This is a client-driven process. You know what best practice is based on. The more they're invested, the more they're committed. So this is client-driven. They're involved with the benchmarks. They're also even involved in telling you when enough is enough. That's what that last bullet is all about. When is enough enough? Because at this point, you can do some prevention planning. They need to be able to let us know when they're getting overwhelmed. But in order for them to feel able to share those feelings, they have to feel safe. And we can make them feel safe by, number one, making sure that they don't be threatened, because what we used to do years ago was to threaten them with, if you don't want to do it, we're going to take who? Thank you. So we remove that threat that we used to use before. We let them know it's okay to be ambivalent. It's normal. And then in addition to that, we take away the whole idea that they should feel guilty. So they need to hear us say, remember, this decision was unplanned, in a crisis, and by default, we need you to let us know when you're going into a crisis. We don't want you to be in a crisis if you're not able to take care of the child. And please, let's talk about an alternative arrangement in your involvement with that child. That's how we make them feel safe. So let's look at what's different between relative caregivers and non-relative foster parents and adoption. Number one, we know that non-relative foster parents and adoption have the option of deciding before the child is placed if this is something that they can and can't do. For relative caregivers, it's in a crisis, they're under pressure, and it's by default. For non-relative caregivers, they have time to contemplate the losses before the child comes into the home. For relative caregivers, they're contemplating those options while they're under stress and while a child is there. So because of the differences in terms of how they come in, we just want the relative caregivers to commit to a process to decide if they can or if they should or shouldn't do it. We don't want them to have to commit to doing it. When we were doing this 10, 15 years ago, we were trying to force them to want to do it. And it was backfiring. We were getting pushed back, and they were becoming walking time bombs. The approach now of saying, hey, it's okay, it's normal, and giving them a timeline for making that decision, benchmarks for making that decision, evidence-based kinds of information to let them be able to make informed decisions, that's what we want them to commit to a process of doing. And then for foster parents and adoptive parents, all they have to do is monitor. For relative caregivers, you have to put those services in place. So in summary, I think it's very important that we think about using those assessments initially to find out what are causing the ambivalence and what's going to cause the loss. That question and exercise that I began with you, that's an inventory of loss, folks. That's an exercise that you can use with families to figure out how is this going to change your life, what that inventory is going to look like, and then asking questions like, when will you need to know? When will you know enough is enough? What could make you change your mind? Because we want to use this to do prevention planning. Prevention planning around not letting them have to go into a crisis in order for the children to leave. If they go into a crisis and decide that the children can't be there, to be able to have an alternative plan. And it's prevention planning. Ultimate prevention planning is to put the services in place so that the placement won't disrupt. Okay. Well, I'd like to end by saying thank you, Annie E. Casey, for allowing me the opportunity to present. I'd also like to thank you for coming and being part of this training, and I hope you find this training useful in your practice. Thank you. Welcome back. Let's summarize this training and let's look at some of the highlights in this module. In this module, we were looking at what were the cues and the sources of loss and ambivalence experienced by relative caregivers. So what I'd like you to do is remember that scenario that you saw the audience go through. And think about those one-word issues: anger, resentment, space, priorities, changes in my lifestyle, daycare, food, money. I think what's crucial for relative caregivers in order to really appreciate what the source is to understand how they come into kinship care. It's unplanned, it's by default, it's in a crisis, and it's without services. Just the way they transition into kinship care results in sources of ambivalence and loss. For foster parents and adoptive parents, it's planned, they pursue it, it's with support and training before the child even gets there. So when we begin to look at those sources, you can see the ambivalence is very much a part of how they transition into providing kinship care. The cues you want to look for are things like, I'm not sure if I can do this. I just want to be a grandparent. I just want to go back to being an aunt and uncle. I'm not sure if this is the right thing for me. If I change my mind, can I get out of it? Are the birth parents going to be okay with it? Because there's safety issues for relative caregivers in terms of how that birth parent feels about them taking that child. And that again can be sources of ambivalence. So what are your goals? The first goal is getting the relative caregiver to commit to a process that will help them decide if they should become permanency options. Significant difference here is that for foster parents and adoptive parents, they come into this knowing they want to be a permanency option. And that option could be foster care, long-term foster care, adoption. So those become the issues for them. They know they want to do it, and what we do is help them figure out if they can. For relative caregivers, they're coming into this not sure and ambivalent, so we need to engage them in a process where they can figure out if this is something they should do. So our initial goal of getting them to commit to the process is what's most essential. Scripts that they're going to need to know and hear is that it's normal, there's nothing wrong with you, it's okay for you to say no, getting the permission to tell us if they can or can't do it, and then preventing up a way to prevent them from having to go into crisis. So when we think about kinship care, I think it's important that we look at using loss and ambivalence as a way of preventing crisis for the relative caregivers, using loss and ambivalence and assessments as a way of preventing children and placements disrupting, and using loss and ambivalence as a way of providing and preventing relative caregivers to getting to that point where they're picking up that cell phone and telling you to come and what? Thank you. So on that note, thank you so much for coming. I hope you find this useful. My thanks to Annie E. Casey for allowing me to present. I hope this is useful in your practice. Thank you.